So the title of this presentation is called "The First Cut is the Deepest," and I'll get back to what I mean by that, but it is, if you were kind of a teenager during a certain year, this was a very kind of famous and melodious song that kind of expressed a lot of heartache about being lovelorn and heartbroken and so on. Originally, I had titled this Design/In/G Culture in homage to David's opening remarks, where he was kind of constantly kind of inserting and kind of deconstructing terms that framed our discussions this week. And this talk, a presentation, is going to happen in 3 parts. The first part's a biography. I'm going to go back to kind of my story about how I came into being fascinated with design and some of the experiences I've had as a designer, some of the things that I've designed. Then the second part is going to work through just a series of provocations, a presentation of some provocations that come out of these experiences. The third part presents some examples that originally were going to be based on live websites. So the whole talk originally had embedded URLs and a dynamism, and those were all actually live middle of last week, but they are now not live because certain things are not loading anymore, and I've had some heroic effort back in California to try to get me versions of things to show in its more dynamic form, but instead what I have now are screen grabs of dynamic websites that I'm not going to be able to reproduce for you the dynamism in this context tonight. And then finally I'll end with a couple comments about in conclusion, what I'm going to work on next, what I think we might want to work on next, and so on. So I'm just going to start with the first part. And so the biography part. See, I was actually trained as a feminist cultural critic, and I've always actually had a fascination with emergent technologies. That's something that preceded my academic training, and it also sustained me through my academic work. I've always made my living as a kind of a pick-me-up technologist. I did that all through high school and then into college and then graduate school. So although I didn't formally study technology in any way as an engineer or a designer, I've always somehow been able to make a living or make ends meet by being a technologist of some sort. An untrained one, but a technologist of some sort. In my academic work, the first set of emergent technologies that I looked at were those that were emergent during the 1980s, a whole series of corporeal technologies like bodybuilding and cosmetic surgery and virtual reality and network communication and so on. And as a feminist critic, I had learned many interesting techniques and methodologies for looking at these technologies, analyzing and understanding and being able to read their kind of cultural implications. But it always seemed that that I was doing it from a kind of point of view of coming in after the party was over, or more what I kind of came to believe, that I was more like a forensics pathologist, that I was actually always coming on the scene after the crime had been committed, and that my job as a feminist critic was to just, render the details of how grisly the crime was. So because technology was always evil, and it was always not operating in women's best interests, and it was, again, this is kind of in the late 1980s and early 90s, and it was something to be held in great suspicion by kind of proper feminist scholars. Well, this created a kind of consternation for me, because I didn't feel that that was going to make for a very creative career or a very kind of inspirational career if all I was ever doing was going off and looking at dead corpses of bad technologies. So I realized that maybe what I wanted to do was to start accumulating a set of insights based on this criticism about how, if I were given the chance, I might do things differently with the technologies that I was kind of fascinated with. And as I started turning my attention to how you do things differently with technology, and this was a provocation that certainly came on like, like a gangbusters with Donna Haraway's publication of her manifesto for cyborgs, I actually realized that not only did I need to start kind of accumulating a set of critical insights, I also needed to start learning more about the cultural conditions under which technologies were produced. And it was actually that turn for me, which was not so much to abandon criticism, but a kind of a dance with the limits of where criticism could take me. And where it took me was to say I needed to in some respects start over and to start looking at the cultural scene whereby kind of technologies kind of emerge. So this was something that you could do once you had tenure, which is what happened. So I consider it a privilege of tenure that I was able actually to, in some respects, start over, to begin again. I started a new book project. I started working on a more kind of specific set of skills, and I started on a path down a different down a different road that took me in unusual places for someone who had been trained to be an academic and had been kind of tenured in the academy. So that was 10 years ago, 15 years ago. I started on the book about 10 years ago. It'll be out in January of next year. It was a long project and a long path. The book is called Designing Culture, The Technological Imagination at Work, and it's actually a transmedia book project. It includes and has included for 10 years. So this isn't a kind of after the fact rationalization. It's actually, this is a book that's been written kind of simultaneously with these other design projects that I've been involved in. It has a print component that will come nicely bound and published by Duke University Press. With the book will come a DVD. There's an exhibit that I participated in that I'll talk a little bit about that I consider part of this project. A series of interactive wall books, things that I've written that are again, interactive pieces. There's a series of maps that will be available on the website. This is the front page of the website. And then a set of short video primers, sort of YouTube video primers on kind of topics on contemporary technoculture, and then there's a blog for the posting of new research and resources and so on. So the frame of the book, several chapters. The frame of the book is looking at contemporary kind of culture and innovation in kind of in the US context, and the kind of frenzy of innovation and the frenzy of the discourse around innovation in the kind of the new millennium. I think the entire book is about the work of a book in a digital age, and the conclusion, in fact, is called that, the work of the book in the digital age. But the first project that actually maps onto the first chapter is called Gendering the Technological Imagination. This is the bridge chapter from my previous work to this work. I will say now, although I'm not going to get into it in great detail, I couldn't have gotten to this work without having gone through the feminist cultural theoretical kind of work and criticism that I did during the process of doing the first book. But the basis for this chapter on gendering the technological imagination was actually an opportunity to go to China in 1995 to participate in the UN World Conference on Women. And you can imagine, this was the last shot I took of Beijing as I was on my way out of the airport. So that was the last time that I was in China. And, I landed at whatever time I landed here in Shanghai. And when I looked up, this was one of the first images that I saw when I had my taxi ride into Shanghai and towards our hotel. And I thought, wow, I have no idea what China's like right now. This delta is pretty significant. So I have to frame these remarks by saying I'm not going to have anything to say about the specificity about China now. I had more to say about the specificity of Beijing, Huairou, the UN conference, and so on, several years ago, 14 years ago, but even those remarks are now best understood in a deeply historical sense. The result of that opportunity to, to go to China was also one of my first ambitious designing projects. And it resulted in an interactive documentary called Women of the World Talk Back. This is a documentary that was, we drafted it to take with us to to Beijing and to Huairou. And we gathered all sorts of documentary footage when we participated in the events during that summer. And by the time, we went out in August, and we had developed a draft or a sketch of this project. We go to the conference, we were there for about a month. By the time we came back, the whole technological landscape had shifted from CD-ROM to the World Wide Web. I mean, it was really one of those moments that within 8 weeks, literally the modes of distribution of digital information shifted from burning your own CDs and distributing them to Mosaic had launched and was being widely taken up. And by the time we got back, the thing that we had planned to do was no longer able to be done in the way we had planned because the technological terrain had shifted under our feet. We went and participated in the NGO forum as a registered NGO. These are the forums that were held in conjunction with these the UN conferences. Beijing was the 4th World Conference on Women. I had taken the opportunity, which is a whole nother story, talked about in the chapter, of the UN conference, Georgia Tech, where I was teaching at the time. Georgia Tech is a historically engineering university. I was there teaching feminist cultural studies of science and technology to white male engineering students. For some reason, Georgia Tech got an invitation to participate in the UN conference. Nobody in the university wanted to go. So about 3 months before the conference, the UN convocation happened, I got the invitation bounced downhill to me, and I said, great, let's send a delegation of female students who are in engineering programs, and let's go. So we took a booth and we kind of staffed it and did all kinds of things for the 17 days of the NGO forum. One of the things we did was took the draft of the interactive documentary, and the way in which this happened was the way in which feminist media work in those days often happened. Almost literally through bake sales and a lot of work for hire. The way in which I raised, at that time it was probably $75,000 to send everybody, was I made bargains with all these units across campus that I would rewrite their material in gender-neutral terms, and I would do and script a recruiting video aimed at women and international students that they could shoot. And it was in exchange for this kind of work that they would give me $1,000 or $10,000 or so on, and that's how we funded taking the delegation to Huairou. Mainly what we did was take it as an opportunity to participate in feminist media activism on a global scale. For however contested and it is, participating in UN conferences are, we also understood that there's always a possibility that you might be able to reach someone who's got their ears still open. So we went, and this is where we ran the recruiting video. Behind us, we ran the interactive documentary, and we went, we talked with women, we interviewed women, and so on. But we also wrote, this was, the scene in Huairou was really interesting. A lot of buildings that weren't finished and so on and so forth, including our hotel, didn't have a roof on it and things like that. You remember that was not, that conference was not really welcomed at the time by kind of by official hosts. But we went writing position papers and creating handouts and so on, lobbying as official lobbying organization who had rights to lobby the members of the U.S. delegation to convince them to argue on the floor of the UN conference for the unbracketing of certain contested assertions and policy statements and so on. Specifically, we went lobbying for the education of women in science and technology, which was a greatly kind of contested area of the Beijing draft platform for action. We were arguing for scientific and technological literacy to be considered a basic kind of universal literacy. We were arguing for media literacy as being considered a basic universal literacy for women, and that women should be encouraged and provided access to literacy programs in science, technology, engineering, and media. Now, of course, certain nations were far more developed on the kind of along the lines of the training of women in science and technology, but that wasn't the case across the globe. So we did have an opportunity, I think, to do our lobbying efforts. That documentary, as I said, kind of includes footage of our efforts there, excerpts from interviews and so on. We came back. It was very video heavy, very audio heavy, and there was really no way to distribute it through the web when we got back. And so to this day, the project, which has been finished and kind of updated as we go along, to this day, this project has never circulated. And it was built at a time when there was about 3 or 4 pieces of feminist media activism available on CDs. So it was built at a time when, you know, feminists were still trying to figure out what was this, the possibilities of this medium and how to make it useful for feminist aims. And indeed, you know, we tried to kind of seize the resources that we had at the time to do this work. And we found out we couldn't distribute it because, again, the technological landscape had changed. When the DVD circulates with the print book in January of 2010, which will be the first time, it's going to be a piece of media activism that is going to look really dated. It has been updated many times. It was built in Director 3. It's now, I don't know even what number we're on, Director 10 or something like that. We've had many problems, and at every point, this is an issue about digital design, at every point when we kind of brought it forward with us and rebuilt it in new applications, we had to make the decision about the kind of the nature of the historical material that's in the piece, and whether or not we recompress the video so it doesn't literally look scratchy, whether we recompress the audio files, and over time, guess what happened? Those things disappeared. All the source material, I mean, 3 or 4 moves myself and so on. So what will circulate with the book is a dusty historical digital archive that I think has immense value because it is a dusty historical digital archive. Not precisely because of what it says about Beijing or that conference. Okay, that was the first project that got me started kind of in a more professional approach to designing. And it was actually those experiences, the disconnect of having the landscape change underneath me, that again, the questions got a little bit more maybe nuanced about the kind of scene of emergence of new technologies. And as you know, as happens every now and again in your life, sometimes you're in the right place in the right time, and in this case I was, and I met somebody who worked at a research institute in Silicon Valley, and he was formulating a new design group, and he issued an invitation to me based on this talk I was giving about the way in which technological work that is culturally motivated can be kind of upended when the technological landscape changes. He heard that talk and he said, maybe you should come closer to the scene of the you know, of the origins. And I'm like, okay, that sounds interesting. So I left academia and I went to a place in the United States that is mythical for creating new technologies. This is a place called Xerox Palo Alto Research Center, sometimes shorthanded Xerox PARC. It's a place that is a corporate research center that's in the business of doing about as close as kind of primary basic research as you can do in a corporate setting. But it's also it's also a place that has as its business producing the mythology that it is the center of innovation of digital culture. It has a long kind of history of producing its own mythology. And I went there as a humanist. They knew that that was my background, who had a research program based on the cultural analysis of emergent technologies. I was there as an outsider who was brought in to be an insider, to change the thinking of the people on the inside by virtue of representing the outside within. My identity and project was like that Mobius strip. And in fact, I talk about that in this chapter on the performance of innovation, where inside, outside, identity, and so on, even the writing of the chapter becomes a kind of an opportunity to kind of theorize on some of these issues about kind of the cultural construction of identity in the context of technologies. I went there primarily to learn about the cultural conditions that shape the emergence of new digital technologies, and I went there to become a practicing designer. And when I was there, I worked as part of a collaborative research group. There was 8 of us. It was called RED. We had a relationship. We were to Xerox PARC what PARC was to Xerox, the corporation. We were supposed to think about the cultural implications of the technologies that were being incubated at this research center. We spent a lot of time talking about the nature of design in a corporate setting. We spent a lot of time talking about the nature of art in a corporate setting. We talked about the constitution of the creative disciplines. We also collaboratively built a museum exhibit called Experiments in the Future of Reading that was based on emergent and embryonic technologies that were being developed at PARC at the time. And the common kind of going in commitment for this project that was taken on by 8 of us as research scientists was that we would, from the beginning, take culture seriously. And the project that we engaged in for a good 18 months before this exhibit kind of showed up in the San Jose Tech Museum was to continually interrogate our research, our design, our work, our interactions, and so on for the cultural implications, the theoretical insights, the kind of dialogue between cultural theory and the work and the stuff we were producing. I served as project manager for this exhibit. It was installed at the San Jose Tech Museum for 6 months. It was down for 6 months, and then it went on a tour throughout the US at different science technology centers and so on. And in the process, we had worked with other groups of people at PARC to develop 11 new reading technologies. These were reading devices that were built on, again, these underlying technologies that weren't intended to be reading technologies, but we were able to work with the researchers to kind of detour the technology development into different ways. So I mean, I'm not even going to go into these because there's so many of them, but one of the things that we built was a reading eye dog. And here I remember Akbar's statement about literal design is bad design. And there's a whole story about the evolution of this dog, where our many permutations to over-theorize a reading machine ended up with the best design being the most literal one, which was to borrow the metaphor of the seeing eye dog to make it a reading eye dog, because a lot of theory got in our way. One of the things that I was involved with specifically as a designer was working on the issue of walls and working on the the issue of narrative. I was kind of the narrative wrangler, the story wrangler, the one who kind of would read and reread the content and the narratives that were being developed. We built a walk-in graphic novel. That's what this is. But one of the pieces in particular that I was involved with the designing, authoring of, that really kind of gave me an extended year-long experience in digital design was what we called an interactive reading wall, or an interactive wall. During the 18 months kind of leading up to this, the entire group did a lot of research on the history of reading. We went through pretty much all the major kind of humanities scholarship, Kathy Davidson's work, manual reading, and we did a kind of study of walls kind of throughout history, the way walls communicate, including the walls. This is the Mathematica exhibit by Charles and Ray Eames, who are in some respects the kind of the designers who start the whole field of information design, primarily through their information design of the Mathematica wall. We looked at all sorts of walls and the way in which walls communicate. We looked at the the history of wall art, like the great muralists throughout Mexico. These are images that I've inserted now. We started scouring for images of walls that that do cultural work in different communities, to start theorizing the role of walls in a digital age. And one of the things that, of course, that we learned is that wall reading, which is called epigraphic reading, is an ancient form of communication. People knew the histories of their culture by reading the writing on the wall. And we also understand that this ancient technology, of course, persists today, as we are all now engaged in the process of reading the wall together. And in some respects, this is the way in which members, individual atomistic members of a culture, literally get on the same page. We get on the same page because we are sharing a kind of synchronicitous relationship to the wall that we're all reading together. This is the wall that we built. It was meant to be monumental in scale. It also occupied the center of the kind of layout of the exhibition. It's 3 16-foot wall segments. The title of the piece is called Episodes in the History of Reading. The history that is arrayed on these walls covers more than 25,000 years. It is a pan-global, pan-national history. There are 36 individual episodes, and this wall tells its story in multiple ways and from multiple vantage points, from 30 feet away, from 10 feet away, from arm's length, and from kind of eye length. There are multiple inscription surfaces. The wall was kind of written on as a kind of a traditional or generic timeline. And then I was the author-designer of these individual episodes. So it allowed me to tell multiple kind of stories, or to tell the kind of stories of this history in a conversational way between the kind of episodic treatment of a story and the kind of span of time, kind of, as history is a spatialized narrative. And what I'm going to try to do, because I can't show you the website on this, is show you how people read this wall. So you would move up to the wall and you would grab the monitor. This is where I knew I was going to make a misclick. There we go. Okay. You grab the monitor and you just pull the monitor along the wall. That's what this young woman is doing. And what happens is, as you pull the monitor along the wall, the material on the screen changes. So all the material is kind of accumulated according to where this monitor is on the wall. It's, there's a sensor. It's position specific. So it's as if the monitor acts as a magic lens to one of the dates that is kind of glossed on the printed wall, and it can give you a more detailed episodic account of things that are very difficult to put as a pinpoint date on a generic timeline. So, you know, here's an episode on the birth of modern communication forms. And she's reading it, and it assembles itself, and so you can't see the dynamism of it, but as you move the screen, the material on the screen assembles itself. Well, I think about this work and the design work that kind of resulted in this piece as kind of working on the poetics of interactivity and exploring the poetics of interactivity that is created in the engagement between a reader's body and this technological device. And what I understood that I was authoring and designing was not simply kind of multiple layers of a history that was going to intersect with one another, but that I was also kind of designing and authoring the orchestration of the reader's body. So it was a kind of turn, and very explicit turn that I discuss in the chapter, turn to Desserteau's notion of walking the city and the poesis of reading that he so beautifully lays out, about reading being a kind of dance between history and forgetting, or forgetting and presence. Over time, we built several walls. This was a really successful project in many respects. Xerox loved it, people loved it. It got a lot of good press. It won some design awards and so on and so forth. But that really doesn't matter when you're in industry. So pretty soon after it came down from the tech museum, the whole group of us got laid off, which is what happens in industry. There is no tenure. So we ended up doing what people do when they get laid off in Silicon Valley. We decided to build a startup company. So what we did was take our two most kind of popular, or I guess kind of reading devices that people resonated with, and we started building them for other clients. One of our first clients was Sun Labs, this is in the Valley. Over time, I ended up staying with that startup company for about 3 years, patching together jobs, because the startup companies don't pay salary very well. I was an adjunct faculty member. I took on freelance curatorial stuff. I still did more work for hire. And over time, we built, over about 3 years, I was involved again with about 3 to 5 additional interactive wall books. And so what will happen on the website that goes with the book is that we will reproduce the dynamic episodes against the static wall images, so that readers, not necessarily, they're not going to get the kind of scale of the monumental, because these walls are installed all over. There's one in Mexico City. There's actually like 5 in Mexico. There's one in Singapore. There's several of these walls across the U.S. So you're not going to be able to get the full embodied experience, but at least you'll be able to understand what I was doing as an author designer in the creation of the dynamism of the topography and the images and so on, as you'll be able to drag a kind of virtual screen across a static wall image to get a sense about how the images change over time. So that project, Designing Culture, the Technological Imagination at Work, has probably a couple more chapters in it, like my return to academia, which gave me an opportunity, or one of the reasons I wanted to return to academia was to kind of bring some of the insights that I gained about kind of the emergent conditions of technology, some of the insights about designing, to bring those back into the academy, specifically to think about the development of new academic programs in the digital humanities, new academic programs. I ran an institute when I came back into the academy. I ran an institute called the Institute for Multimedia Literacy, so thinking about kind of new literacies, digital media and learning and so on. So most of the work that I've been involved with for the last 5 years since I've been back has been the kind of the labor of working the paradigm shift and understanding kind of really what it means to kind of work to shift a paradigm from kind of the trenches of the academy. So this is the end of this book. There are new projects that are coming out of this, but it's a project that will now see the light of day for the first time at the beginning of next year. So let me turn to some provocations, both about technology, technoculture, and then about designing. These provocations are in a simple list, right? And these are provocations that I try to take some pains in, even in the book. First of all, to always use the term technoculture to help to try to discipline myself not to continue to make that divide between technology and culture. I try to historicize and localize the insights wherever possible. So I can say, with some description that this is about kind of the scene of technoculture in contemporary U.S. culture, and then I go and try to particularize that in different chapters. And I'm not going to talk so much about these provocations about technology, about not being objects, about technocultures being historically constituted, and so on. Let me just make one point about getting to these insights about technoculture through kind of feminist cultural theory. I pretty much started on this project because I was hijacked by one phrase that Haraway writes in her Manifesto for Cyborgs. And I can say I've been working on this for 10 years. And the phrase was, she said it, I've heard her say it many times in my early days when I first saw her talk. She said, all technologies are reproductive technologies. And so this past decade is pretty much what I've spent doing, is trying to figure out what does that mean. And I think I have a provisional explanation, and it's developed in the book. It talks about a double logic of reproduction and the necessary double logic of all technologies, where all technologies are reproductive in that they both replicate parental material and they always make the expression of something new simultaneously available. So novelty is always possible in the development of new technologies, but no technology is entirely novel. And this is how all technologies reproduce the previous and make it new again. This is the consequence of the dance between contingency and indeterminacy, and this is also the space of design. As we've talked about before, design is not predictable, it is emergent, and this led to some provocations about design, including the fact that design is one of the premier kind of practices of cultural reproduction in our age. I start by saying that design is a pan-disciplinary discursive formation. There are many people that are writing interesting work about design, and cultural theory actually has a lot to say about the cultural implications of design as a practice of meaning-making. One of the people that I was early influenced by was Klaus Krippendorff's work on the semantic turn. It's towards a new theory of design. It was a piece I read when it was in manuscript. It's called A Trajectory of Artificiality, Principles of Design for the Information Age, in which he arrays kind of on an ontological kind of scale the kind of differences between products, goods, interfaces, multi-user systems, projects, and discourses, all of which are designed and all of which are designed according to certain logics. And that's the kind of his project, is to elaborate the kind of semantics of designing that could be said to be at work in all of these different things, although these things are ontologically very different. So design is pan-disciplinary. design as a verb and designing as a process. If in the humanities I ground my work with Klaus Krippendorf, in the engineering sciences I ground my work in the thought of, or the work of a number of design philosophers, Terence Love, Richard Coyne, Larry Leifer, who works out of Stanford product design program, and they're very conscientious about trying to use the term designing rather than design. And again, it's another kind of self-disciplining, trying to kind of constantly remember to kind of keep the word designing as an active, kind of active verb. One of the things that as I reflect on the experiences that I had in doing and making design, working collaboratively design, is understanding that designing involves conversations. It is a dialogic project, and it's a project of creating a conversation among agents. And the nature of those agents is very interesting, because there are certainly a number of human agents, and human agents could be those who have the identity of designer, those who have the identity of user, those who have the identity of, sometimes we call them stakeholders, and so on. But it's also about agents who are cyborgian, who are not like intelligent agents, and people who are technologically mediated, and also conversations with the material world, where there's an understanding where the materiality of the world also always exercises an agency in the conversations about designing. As we've talked about earlier, you know, the understanding that designing relies on and perpetrates ambiguity. The first thing that ambiguity is not only the first thing that you kind of encounter when you're designing and engaging in designing, it's also what you pass along, and it's what gets passed over the transom from one set of design agents to another set of design agents. The first thing actually that gets designed when any new agent kind of comes onto the designing scene is what is to be designed. So in some respects, you know, the statement that we were talking about earlier last week about you don't know what you've designed until you've designed the solution, is kind of another way of saying kind of this thing, is that when the first thing you design is really trying to figure out what it is that you're supposed to be designing. And that might be by starting with what's the genre of what you're designing, what's your category of thing that you're designing, what is there an instance of that you might be doing a design kind of remediation of. Designing is inherently collaborative. All the design work I've done has been collaborative in one fashion or another. It doesn't make it easy. I talk a lot about the ethics of collaboration in the book. I actually talk about designing as an articulatory practice, where you're literally articulating and making the connections among disparate elements that will become kind of linked in a new semantic ensemble or assemblage. There are many different categories of articulatory practice that get kind of woven into the design process. There's managerial kind of articulatory practice. There's semantic articulatory practice, so on. But designing as itself is the practice of making meaning through the forging of linkages. I also argue kind of now that designing is one of the key processes whereby culture is reproduced. And therefore, this is kind of my hobby horse in my academic settings, is designing is an inherently ethical practice, because it is involved in the process whereby the cultural conditions of the future are created. And then finally, the last provocation is all designing begins with the cut. And as we know, the first cut is the deepest. And to this, I turn to another feminist theorist, Karen Berard, who's a feminist philosopher, physicist, who returns to Niels Bohr, the famous, renowned physicist, to rethink Bohr's take on Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. And I'm not going to go into Berard's my gloss on Berard's kind of deep exegesis of Niels Bohr, but suffice to say that it was Berard who got me thinking and reflecting on that the very kind of nature of reality in a quantum kind of world is that it is a simultaneously kind of multiply ontological at the same time, right? That we can see the faces or we can see the vase, but in fact you cannot see both at the same time. It's just like you cannot measure in a quantum kind of perspective, you cannot measure the position of an element and the momentum of an element. That is the fundamental uncertainty, indeterminacy of Heisenberg's kind of founding principle. And so Berard argues that given this as a kind of basic understanding of kind of the nature of our ontology, that the first thing that we have to do is we have to pick one or the other, and that's the cut into the ontology that we make. That we can either choose to measure position or we can choose to measure momentum. And you can oscillate between the two, but at any one point, you're only doing one. And so when she talks about unpacking the implications of this, it's a beautiful set of articles. The one that I'm referring to now is called How Matter Comes to Matter. It is a necessary corrective to the linguistic turn. It starts with her phrase, language has been given too much power. And her argument is that we need to, kind of coming out of a kind of feminist philosophical tradition, it is inevitable that we make cuts, and we need to be ethically accountable for the cuts that we make. Because from the first cut, many things follow. So it was Karen's work that helped me understand that, in fact, what designing is about is the inevitability of making that first cut, and then the endless post hoc rationalization about why that first cut was the right cut to make. Okay, last part. Designing digital technoculture. Now, this is where I was going to turn to examples of how contemporary culture is being redesigned through a whole host of digital practices, most of which are available through Windows on the web. I'm going to talk about 4 categories of examples that I can now only show you through static screenshots. I'll talk about new imaginary landscapes, literacies of the future, new ways of reproducing culture, and the new forms of embodiment and sociality. The first one I want to talk about is just, the idea of the imaginary landscape. This is the imaginary landscapes. I know that many of you are familiar with places like Second Life and so on. Well, here's one. This is the museum. Let's see here. The Museum of Virtual Art. It's it's created by a newspaper in Uruguay, and it's a dynamic museum that exists only on the web, and it presents aspects of Uruguayan art, contemporary art. It is not built in Second Life. It's built on an independent platform. You're dropped into, and it's very beautifully done. It was a decade in the making. It was definitely a kind of an expensive proposition, but as the director says, it was nowhere near as expensive as actually building a physical museum. You're dropped into the plaza, you can navigate, you are the mouse, you kind of navigate into the main gallery, you can get information about the exhibitions, you can see images of the virtual architecture that, of all the different phases of the development of the museum. So here you can see that they built the museum according to kind of pretty standard architectural practices, different kinds of planner kind of design, some CAD design, so on. And then this is one of the galleries that you can now explore by kind of moving around in a kind of a 2D representation of 3-dimensional space. It's featuring the works of young artists, contemporary emergent artists, and so on. I really don't have enough of a cultural context to evaluate the quality of the art, but it is getting a lot of attention right now as kind of one of the most kind of provocative opportunities to use the web to make the voices of really kind of unheard of artists available to kind of a much wider project. One of the projects that I'm most familiar with, there are many of these now starting out. These are online places of scholarship where scholarship is literally being done in a new vernacular. This is Vectors. It's called the Journal of Technology, Culture and Technology in a Dynamic Vernacular. Let's see here. The third issue has been out for a while. It was on the concept of difference, and it includes, in this case, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 articles. There's a couple more places like Vector Space and so on. These are peer-reviewed articles done by, in some cases, established scholars, in other cases, independent kind of cultural workers and artists. And Vectors is, here's a Vectors article. It's visually dense. It has kind of, it's multimodal. Most of the articles have beautiful music and different kinds of dynamic image, text, modes of interactivity, and so on. This happens to be an article by Minu Molin on reading through the kind of metaphor, visual metaphor of Persian carpets. And there's different ways in which kind of she makes meditations about the kind of cultural context of the commoditization of these carpets, or these carpets as commodities. David, don't be embarrassed, but I'm showing this piece because I really actually had hoped to show it live. This is, and I'm not just saying this because you're my friend, I love this piece. It's called Blue Velvet, Redressing New Orleans in Katrina's Wake, by David Goldberg and Stefka Hystrova, with design by Eric Lawyer. One of the reasons I love this piece is because it's so teachable. One of the things that these new pieces are doing, whether it's in Vectors or Kairos or a number of the journals that are showing up now that are publishing digital scholarship now, not only in the digital humanities, but increasingly in the digital social sciences and the digital fine arts and so on. One of the reasons I'm interested in this work is because it makes a very strong case for literacy not being a closed-off conversation about children. It reminds us that, in fact, literacy is a lifelong project, that we all have to learn how to read and write over and over and over again. That thinking that any literacy program, it begins and ends with the early grades of K through 6 or so on, is wrong. And I think the way in which these projects foreground to some of the most kind of recalcitrant scholars is it lays down the challenge of how much of a commitment do they have to really being lifelong learners. Because what these pieces of scholarship require literally is you've got to learn how to read again. You've got to learn how to make sense of dynamic topography, of the relationship of moving image and text, of, again, a kind of poetics of interactivity, of the relationship of kind of music, landscapes, and so on. And the reason I use David's piece, one, because I'm familiar with it and the topic of Katrina is very current for the students, but it also makes the argument easy for my students to grasp about what it means to learn to read or write, and what it means to be confronted with a text you cannot read that's in a language that you think you have access to. So these are students at USC, they're all native English speakers for the most part, and here there's all this English, and yet they don't, when I ask them to summarize the paragraph, the article, or the argument, they don't know how to do it. And so one of the things I have to do is kind of do a master reading with them to show them how one reads this kind of a piece. And it is in those moments that their literacy is literally being extended. And what we know, of course, is as these journals and the new genres of digital scholarship get reproduced and so on, certain new conventions of reading and writing will develop. I mean, we already so take for granted all kinds of new digitally designed literacy conventions of the link, of the node, of the explosion, of the particular relationship of context and detail. So we already have plenty of experience with the kind of conventions of literacy changing. What we're now kind of exploring are the ways in which these literacies can also serve the production of new scholarly insights and the kind of the production of communication about scholarship in new vernaculars. So again, under the category of things that I had hoped I would be able to show live, I wanted to show several YouTube videos on kind of remixing history for the purposes of contemporary cultural criticism. One of the things that I'm a little concerned about, this is just me being kind of an old fart, is these digital kind of design techniques and digital genres like remix and mashups and machinima and so on, while they are proving to be very potent genres of cultural criticism, and a lot of people and kids and youth are becoming familiar with making these kinds of genres. They are ways, obviously, of reproducing culture, but there is a way in which these digital pieces privileges memes over memory, and I think one of the next projects I'm going to work on is really on this notion of memory and remembering in a digital age, because I have students now who I consider, and they themselves consider themselves just-in-time learners, who, with a straight face, ask me why it's important to remember. And I remember a couple years ago at the other SECT Technospheres, George Lewis started his presentation with the assertion, every day the web forgets more than it remembers. So I think there's something critical that needs to be worked out, probably in theory as well as in kind of close analysis, about the kind of memory practices that are actually kind of emerging and becoming conventionalized and so on, and the consequences, and we need to be watching about the consequences of the prosthetics memory that we're creating, like the World Wide Web and all of these archives that give us the illusion of having archived things, but of course they don't really. A couple other projects. Okay, here's the other one that we wanted to show, and I don't think Miki's piece came. So we wanted to show this this DVD called Beautiful World that offers a kind of sustained cultural critique using the languages of contemporary graphic arts, advertising, and so on. We searched the web, we couldn't find it. I finally got in touch with her in Amsterdam, so there is a copy of the DVD coming to you at the hotel. So maybe by the end of the week, yeah, maybe we'll have it. So this was the closest. This all media site is the closest thing I could get to kind of show you what I meant by cultural criticism that uses the vernaculars of kind of branding, of kind of advertising logic, and so on, to produce insightful cultural criticism. Now, this is also a strategy of a lot of contemporary art, so it's certainly not particular to graphic design. Okay, last point on how also is digital design kind of premier kind of cultural reproductive technology in the way in which it enables the reproduction of literal new embodiments, new species. If any of you are visitors of Second Life or Second Life inhabitants, the range of new species that are kind of resident in Second Life is just amazing. This is a furry avatar. This is a rated G furry avatar. There are many other furry avatars. Here's a very famous kind of avatar. We are making fantastic projections of ourselves, of human identity, of playing with identity, and so on in these new virtual spaces. Not only Second Life, but a number of them that are forming up. And there is, I think, something also changing about our thinking about embodiment, the embodiment that is repressed as we engage long parts of our day in these virtual environments. So I wonder about what kind of parts of our embodiment is being kind of atrophying. But I also wonder what it's saying about our kind of imaginary kind of understandings about what it means to be human, the reconfiguration of race, which goes on in a kind of displaced way in the creation of new kinds of classes of avatars, species of avatars, and so on. I could not, I will tell you, I searched for several hours. I could not find one image of Facebook. Now, I know Facebook is blocked, but so are the images of Facebook going through Google Images. So even on sites that don't refer to Facebook and aren't on Flickr. So I could not find one. I just couldn't. I went 28, 30 pages deep into the image search, and I couldn't find anything that would load onto my computer. This is a image of the social networks produced through Twitter connections and so on, and it's the best I could find. I literally couldn't find any kind of the really beautiful schematizations of this kind of the logics of social networking that are produced by Facebook and so on, that start to map the new dynamism of sociality, right? About one person being connected to how many other people and where those the densities of connections are, and how frequent are your connections to different people, and the different kind of arrays of frequencies and so on. Couldn't find it. So this is standing in for a whole bunch of stuff that has to do with social networks, new senses of sociality, and so on. Okay. So finally, the last comment. If I were to think about things that I want to work on next, things like theorizing the kind of infrastructure of contemporary technocultures, some of the things that I would look at are things like the container box, the shipping box, that Mark Levinson is the one who wrote the book called The Box, How the Shipping Container Made the World Smaller and the World Economy Bigger. I find shipping containers fascinating, as much because there's so many shipping container projects going on up and down California now. I mean, Oakland's got a whole art colony of rentable art spaces. I've got a half a dozen friends who have their studios are shipping containers on their property and so on. So in the US, I think that as shipping containers are emptied now and sitting around, and they're becoming really cheap to purchase. You don't even have to rent them anymore. I think we're going to see a lot more interesting shipping container architecture, which I just think is really fascinating. I remain interested in walls. Walls are important technology of cultural reproduction. I wonder what happens when we become more, in an age of ubiquitous computing, when the walls can be modulated by multiple people at a time, what the walls are going to look like and what we're going to do with the walls. I have some beautiful images. I've been taking images as I've been here of people reading the walls. I love the fact, this happens also in Mexico. I've gotten several images of people in the park reading the newspaper on the wall. I'm interested in the way in which people read walls. Gateways are becoming a kind of meta issue in terms of network structure and so on, about monitoring gateways, privatizing gateways. This is one of the techno structures underlying the questions about net neutrality and so on, about whether or not all the gateways on the internet are going to remain open or not. And we're not talking about nation-induced firewalls, but we're talking about the privatization of certain gateways to different nodes of information. So I remain interested in mapping, and certainly Prezi. I have several Prezi maps up, and I'm kind of returning back to an old notion of kind of cognitive mapping, cultural formations, and producing these interactive maps. And then finally, to return to kind of an old question coming out of my old sociology days, how, in understanding that kind of oscillation between, the position of the particle and the momentum of the particle, and understanding that all we can ever get is an oscillation, which some physicists say that the fastest we can oscillate thoughts is 0.25 of a second. The question is, how do you study oscillation? And it's kind of returning to a really old question of sociology, which is how do you study change, which again is kind of the difference of the delta, right? How do you study the delta? And when the delta is not just simply two positions, but it's also the momentum between those two positions. And I think this problem of oscillation, or the question of oscillation, the dynamism of oscillation, when we're moving, between one side and another, one thought and another, is something I don't have a theoretical kind of handle on. I just know that it is the engine. It is a kind of dynamic engine of both theory and kind of cultural change, and I think we need to do more work in that. And that's it. Thank you.